Sporting Journal Radio, presented by Onyx.
I don't want to get into politics too much here, but I made a joke on Facebook after the day that they were going to read the verdict for the Kyle Rittenhouse trial. And I said, because I predicted riots for sure. I figured he would be acquitted, and I figured, or not guilty, and I figured there'd be riots over there. I'm glad that there weren't. Mm-hmm. But I made the joke on Facebook. I said maybe the opening day of the gun deer season in Wisconsin isn't the best time to start rioting in Wisconsin. And that's because Wisconsin's been called the 8th largest army in the world during the gun deer season, when there's 650,000 guys carrying rifles through the woods. But and I'm not advocating for violence. I'm not saying whatever, but people are going to be armed and going to defend themselves, and as they should, rightfully so. And that reminded me, though, of a story that you told me about when the riots were going on in Minneapolis. And you live in Uptown.
I live in Uptown, Minneapolis,
where a lot of this stuff was going on, and a lot of your neighbors kind of like they were kind of calling on you to protect the neighborhood a little bit.
Yeah. So where George Floyd happened, I'm probably about 1.5 miles from George Floyd, where that happened. The precinct that burned down is about 2 miles from my house. And the precinct they tried to burn down the next night is actually the precinct that I would, that is supposed to protect and serve my neighborhood. And that's about 3/4 of a mile from my house. And then where I live is, it used to be, before the riots, it's not anymore, but it used to be a pretty thriving little community, a lot of mom and pop shops. We had bigger shops, like we had Apple, Columbia, a couple of the bigger corporations in there as well. So a lot of people would spend time there. And man, when the riots happened, all those stores, they got emptied. It was crazy.
Yeah, it's a bad deal. No question about it. But it just goes to show that having, again, not advocating for any violence, of course, but having the ability to defend yourself is such an important aspect of daily life, it seems like, in this America right now. So I'm sure your neighbors were glad that you were there.
I will say this. There was at some point, there was a time when my neighborhood was, they had actually published a magazine saying it was probably the most liberal neighborhood in the United States.
Wow.
So when everything happened, there might have been 3 people that owned firearms in that neighborhood. My wife and I were part of those 3 people. There may have been one other guy. Some guys, they had some pellet guns and stuff like that, but nothing else. So, we went out, and we were like, when everything happened, I just kind of walked out there. A lot of my neighbors, we walked out there, and we're watching all these buildings being rioted. And some of my neighbors were like, well, we need to call the cops. I'm like, we already called them. They're not coming. Right? They are so busy with stuff going on across the city. They don't have the manpower to do this. So they're like, well, I guess we're just going to sit here and watch them. I'm like, that's all you can do, right? Like, what's 7 to 8 people going to do with an entire, there was probably 200, 300 people out in the streets robbing everything. And it wasn't till there was a lady that was across the street. She started videotaping it with her cell phone. And this guy charged her and grabbed her by her throat, picked her up and threw her down on the ground, started punching her face. And then at that point, it was time to stop, right? Time to get involved. And my wife and I ran out there, and, a lot of people have asked me, well, your wife followed you out there. And it's like, yeah, there's only really one person in that neighborhood that I knew would not run away from the situation if I needed help. And though I don't want it to be my wife, that is my best friend. That is my partner in crime in everything I do. So I knew that for 100% she would support me and try to, make sure nothing bad happened to me, and vice versa for her. But we got out there, we shut that situation down. And after that, it really escalated. We had a couple of guns pointed at us. And so, I tell people, unfortunately, I had to grab my firearms. I had to arm up and go out there, and we shut the block down. And since then, since George Floyd, I've had about 37 firearms pointed at me A lot of it happened during the George Floyd riots, but it's continued to go on. We had Dante Wright incident that happened here. Then we had the stuff with Kyle Rittenhouse. So we've had a couple of times that we've had some little riots and up kicks, and it's been different. I've had a lot of friends that were like, well, how do you think Kyle was able to do that? He went out there with his guns, and I've told them, I'm like, there's not a big difference between what happened with Kyle and what happened with me. I was out there with my firearm. However, I have neighbors. We have neighbors that left, but I also have neighbors that depend on public transportation. They have nowhere else to go. So are we going to let their buildings burn down? Are we going to let them be robbed and their houses broken into and vandalized? So yeah, we had to shut our blocks down, and I used my competition AR. I've had the most rounds through that, so that's what I grabbed. That's what I trust. So I was out there with that, and I had my Atlas carry gun with me. We shut it down, and I tell people, Kyle had a bad night. Things went wrong. I got lucky. I was able to keep my cool, and I had a lot more people around me that could support me, so I wouldn't have to be the one that just went through trial like that guy. So I definitely understand where he's coming from, but I also feel for him at the same time.
Hear more at sportingjournalradio.com or wherever you get podcasts. 852 million acres of public land, 147 million private properties, all in the palm of your hand. The #1 hunting GPS app just got better. With hundreds of custom map layers, 3D and topographic maps, you can easily scout on the road or at home before you go. And now you can get important weather details, CWD detection, and even know what crops have been planted where. Get the most trusted hunting GPS app ever made. OnX. Know where you stand with OnX.